Hey, Black Belt reads the best books I read this year. Man, this was a tough list to do. I whittled it down to like 20 books, and then 15, and then finally 10. Top 10. 10 best books I read this year. I read 130 books according to my Goodreads. Some of those are very short, like graphic novels, so don't think it's like 130 books, that took me a week to read or anything. Number 10. I tried to put these in order according to how much I thought about them, how much I liked them, and it was really tough, very challenging. Some of these videos I do are pretty easy for me to put 10 books, like, 10 horror books you should read. This was challenging because I thought very deeply about each one and how much I liked it if I had to rank them. Anyway, the very first, number 10, Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami. The first Murakami I've read, the only still so far, but I loved it. Man, it was so beautiful. It had just such a sense of nostalgia, sad, cold, depressing, kind of coming of age. It was beautifully written. There were some scenes in here that were just gorgeous to read. There is some weird sex stuff because it's about a young guy and he's got some weird stuff going on, but that was way overshadowed by all the beautiful, beautiful writing in here. I wish I could just take a paragraph and just read it out loud for you, but I think everyone would tune out at that point. So I won't do that, but it's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Number 9, Raymond Carver. Specifically, what we talk about when we talk about love. I believe that is his second. I skipped it. I did not read Will You Please Be Quiet, Please, because um, I just was told specifically to read what we talk about when we talk about love as like his first. And it was amazing. Very sparse writing with just kind of a sense of dread. It's a collection of short stories. Each story, it's very simply written, but it just really captivated me the whole time. Kind of like on the edge of your seat. I watched a review after I read this. He said, reading this felt like you were sitting at a kitchen table and there was a loaded gun between you. It's just like that's kind of the feeling of dread. He captured that beautifully in the way he said it. Um, I I want to go back and read the first one and then read the whole thing. This is a really cool hardcover. Very happy I picked it up. What we talk about when we talk about love. Number 8, Hex, the first horror book on the list. Actually, the only horror book on the list, I think. So I guess this was my favorite horror book I read this year. I didn't really think that was the case until I started really looking at everything I read. This one just rose to the top. It was either this or You Like It Darker by Stephen King. I went with this. It was very original. It had me just sort of enthralled the whole time, just wanting to know what is going on in this crazy town with a witch from the 1800s or the 1700s or something just walking around. Yeah, Hex is creepy and original. It really was. It was actually original. There was some really brutal scenes in here. I'm curious if you guys have ever read any of his other books. Should I check them out? Because I love Hex. So I think he's got 2 other novels. Thomas Old Hoyvelt, maybe? Anyway, Hex was great. Really loved it. My favorite horror book I read this year. Hex may be the only horror book on the list. There's actually one more I guess you could consider horror. You could almost consider this horror in some ways. Number 7, Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This was one of the big undertakings of the year that I wanted to read. I've read Dostoevsky before. I've read Notes from Underground. when I was young. White Nights is really, really good as well. Those are both really short, but this is not. This was quite an undertaking, and I was intimidated. It's over 500 pages, yeah, almost 600 pages. Don't be intimidated. It wasn't a challenging read at all. It was beautifully written, beautifully done. Uh, I was pretty much captivated from the get go. I did not expect it to go to some of the places it went, and I can see why this is considered one of the best books ever written. It really is. It really was. I'm so glad I finally read it this year. Next up for Dostoevsky, I've got The Brothers Karamazov. Um, really want to read that as well, but again, it's huge. I think it's even bigger than this book. But maybe I shouldn't be intimidated because this was not hard to read. I mean, it was captivating. I kept going the whole way through, loved it. Number six, A Short Stay in Hell. I guess this is technically a horror book too. I didn't think of it that way when I was putting it on the list, but it is. This is the shortest book on the list this year, maybe even one of the most recent ones on the list. Um, Even though it's so short, it's one of the books I've thought about the most. Very psychological, afterlife, um, philosophical horror. Yeah, I guess it really is horror. I I wonder if this author's written anything else. I would love to check it out. This was beautifully done. Really, really thought provoking. Short Stay in Hell by Stephen Peck. All right, we're on to the top five now. This is where it got really challenging. There were so many books I wanted to put in the top five. So many books that didn't make it onto my list that really deserved a spot. I just had to make cuts, right? Like Blackwater, loved Blackwater. Uh, yeah, so many, so many. But number five is going to be Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang. Kind of like A Short Stay in Hell, this is one of the books that I've thought about the most since I've read it. I loved it. I didn't love five star, love every single short story in the collection, but the ones that I did were amazing. Some of my favorites of all time. Specifically, the title book, Stories of Your Life and Others. The movie Arrival was based on that short story, and it's pretty much the same, just some small differences. And the short story, Hell is the Absence of God. Very thought provoking. Religious horror is just my jam. It just is. I loved it. I thought about it so much, and I'm really excited to read his second short story collection, Exhalation. Definitely want to read that in 2025. This was the only sci-fi book on the list. Crazy. Number four, All the Pretty Horses. I read a lot of McCarthy this year. I read three, four, five, six, I think six. No, seven, because I reread Suttree. None of these are rereads. These are all fresh. Rereading doesn't count. If it did, Suttree would probably be here. But yeah, I read, so what did I say, seven McCarthy books this year. But this was my favorite one out of those. It's just the one that stuck with me the most. All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy. One of the most beautiful books I've ever read. I guess there's a theme here. I really like beautiful writing. This was just a lot different than some of the other books of him, especially if you're reading chronologically. This is a huge step in a different direction, coming off of Blood Meridian. I mean, that is quite an interesting jump that he made here. It really worked. I think he really hit his stride here. The characters are captivating, frustrating. Um, yeah, John Grady Cole is like, man, I can relate to him so much, but at the same time, he's so frustrating. But that's what it's like to be a young man, right? one of the most beautiful opening sentences, paragraphs. I think it's the opening sentence where he talks about walking into the room and the light from the candle flickers with as the wind from him coming in the room. It's beautifully done. Loved it. Number four, All the Pretty Horses. Top three. Man, this was tough. This was really tough. This might surprise some people. Gardens of the Moon by Steven Erikson. This was one of the most challenging books I read all year long. I don't know if it was the most challenging. I'm just going to say it was. Not in that it's got all these big words like Moby Dick that's like you're having to look in a dictionary and stuff. It's challenging in that he just kind of throws you into this world and you don't know what's going on and you feel lost. But I just embraced it. The people that recommended this to me just said, just read it, embrace it. If you're really lost, at the end of each chapter, just go read like a summary on the Malazan wiki, and that really helped a lot. I feel like I read the book twice because after every chapter, I would go read a summary of the chapter and be like, oh man, I don't know why that didn't click with me. This would benefit greatly from a reread, but I'm going to read all 10 books in the core series here and then, one day reread them. I'm about halfway through the second book of Malazan, but I didn't quite get it done for this year. I really thought about this book a lot after I read it. I think that it grew on me more and more after I read it. That's impressive. When you read something and maybe I didn't think it was 5 stars right after I finished it because it was so challenging. I don't know. The more it sat with me, the more I thought about it, the more I grew to really love it. And it became one of my favorite books of the year. Number three, top three out of 130 books. Now, I told myself I wanted to read maybe two of the Malazan books a year for the next 5 years and be done with the series. I didn't quite get the second book done. There's just so many good books. There's so many books to read. About halfway through though. But these are long books. They're challenging. Book two is challenging as well. I feel lost again as well. So, really enjoying the ride though. Just gotta go slow, enjoy it, and pacing myself. I'm not trying to force it, which is why I didn't finish the second book yet. All right, number two. This shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. It is East of Eden. This was my second favorite book I read all year long. My favorite classic literary fiction, my favorite Steinbeck. And I haven't read a ton of Steinbeck, but this was just on another level. This is considered his greatest book by a lot of people, maybe even by himself. Man, it was incredible. Absolutely incredible. Again, this was a huge book. I think this is the longest book I read all year long. It was 590 pages. Maybe Gardens of the Moon was longer. This is it's incredible. Absolutely beautiful writing. So I would put Steinbeck, Cormac McCarthy, Raymond Carver, kind of all in that same group of beautiful writing that doesn't have to be overly dense, like William Faulkner. You know, I'm talking about All the Pretty Horses specifically. If you're gonna read like Blood Meridian, that's pretty dense with words you've never heard and stuff. But All the Pretty Horses was more in the vein of this. Look at the back of here. You can see this picture of Steinbeck just smoking a cigarette. What a stud! That's a handsome man too. What a massive undertaking this was, and I didn't even realize until I was reading it that like he inserts himself and his own actual family into this. So it's kind of like fictional autobiography in a way. Very interesting. Man, this any other year would probably be number one. It made me cry. It made me laugh. I think about the character Samuel still a lot. He's like one of my favorite characters of the entire year. But there is a reason it's not number one, and you're about to see. It's because of this, the Blade itself. This is number one. This is why nothing else stood a chance. This was my favorite book I read all year. One of my favorite books of all time. My favorite fantasy book I've ever read. I think it was better than Game of Thrones. Now it's been years. It's been like a decade since I've read Game of Thrones, so maybe that's not fair because I was a freak for the Game of Thrones books when I read them. Maybe I'll reread them and think differently, but man, this was incredible. The character work, phenomenal. Samuel from East of Eden, one of the best characters ever. John Grady Cole from All the Pretty Horses, one of my personal favorite relatable characters. I could go on and on. But the Blade itself, it's on a whole other level. You're talking about Glocta. That's one of the greatest characters ever written. You're talking about Logan Ninefingers. Again, one of the greatest characters ever written. Like these two stand above pretty much everything else I read all year long. I was just walking around quoting the book, speaking like them. My family is just like, please shut up. I was obsessed. I read this, and like Malazan, this is a not 10. I think there's 9 books back there. It might be 10 at this point. I don't remember. But I was like, I'm gonna read a couple of books a year and read all these. Well, that didn't happen. I ended up reading the entire First Law trilogy this year because it was so good, and I just had to know what was gonna happen. And unlike Gardens of the Moon, it wasn't crazy, dense, confusing. It was just beautifully done, perfectly plotted, perfectly executed. I loved it. Sometimes I wouldn't know what was going on. It all comes back. It's yeah, my number one book of the year, The Blade itself. So looks like I ended up with 2 fantasy books, 1 sci-fi, 2 horror, and then the rest of them were all like classic. And then Norwegian Wood is kind of in that same vein. So that's my style. Obviously, this is the kind of books I like to read. I'm really excited for 2025. I have like 10 books that I'm like in the middle of, and there's so many good books that it's hard to pick one to read. But that's a good problem to have, you know. That's good. Pretty soon, I will be doing my favorite graphic novels that I read for 2024. So if you like this kind of thing and you like graphic novels, stay tuned. I'll try to get that one done as well before the end of the year. And yeah, hope everyone has a good Christmas. Appreciate you guys all. Thanks.